However, in recent years, the reductionist paradigm has run into trouble, especially in trying to explain the processes in living systems, processes like embryology, evolution of consciousness. And over in the physics department, the reductionist paradigm has not been capable of supporting any theoretical framework with which we can understand the complex results of quantum mechanics. So for a couple of decades now, there's been a growing acceptance in the scientific community that some new way of thinking will be required to explain all these phenomena. Now, running alongside the reductionist paradigm over the centuries, though with less success, has been its opposite, the holistic paradigm. And holism is where we try to understand things not in terms of their constituent parts, but in terms of how the parts all come together to form the whole. I think the holistic paradigm was first articulated by Gottfried Leibniz in 1714, and it made its first appearance in the English language in a book called Holism and Evolution in 1926, in which the author, a South African called Jan Smuts, pointed out that many things in the universe, including all living things, function only as a whole. Take a horse, for example. We can't really break a horse down into its constituent parts. If we take out the liver stops working and the horse stops working. We can only engage with the horse as a whole, complete thing, all the parts working together. And all living things are like that. They only work when all the parts are working together. In fact, that's how they work, by all the parts coming together, working together to form the whole. Now, there's one very useful illustration or picture or diagram that I can give you that explains how the holistic paradigm hangs together. It's called the chain of greater wholes, and it's very easily explained. The basic idea is that a whole on one level will become a part of a whole on the next level up. So if we start out with an atom, which is a whole comprised of subatomic parts, and it's a whole, but it's a part of the whole on the next level up, say a molecule, which again is a whole, but a part of a compound, which in turn is a part of a cell, or might be part of a cell. And the cell is a lovely example of a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. But in turn, it's also a part of the whole on the next level up, say a liver. And the liver in turn is part of the horse, or a human being. And are we in turn also parts of a whole on the next level up? The collective unconscious, society, Gaia. In any case, the chain of greater wholes gives us a direct holistic connection between ourselves and our atoms. And from whatever level on up, the Earth is a whole that organises itself and part of the whole on the next level up, the solar system, which is a whole, but then part of a galaxy, which is then part of the universe, after which point I suspect it's fruitless to speculate further. So there is our chain of greater wholes. Isn't it lovely? Doesn't it hang together beautifully? A lovely series of parts and wholes from atoms all the way up to galaxies. And this does actually give us enough pieces of the puzzle for me to tell you about the most difficult aspect of the holistic paradigm, the bit that is so opposed to the reductionist paradigm that it is difficult for us to get our heads around and for many people just will not compute. The secret heart of the holistic paradigm is that each whole on every level is organising itself with a measure of consciousness. And the implication of that is that each whole on every level, in possessing a measure of consciousness, must also be alive, must be a living entity, which means that atoms and molecules, as well as planets, solar systems, galaxies, and the universe, are all alive at some level and organising themselves with an appropriate measure of consciousness. Now, I'm sure that many of you at this point are saying, no way. What is this hippie rubbish this guy wants us to believe? But this is in fact the only difficult bit of the holistic paradigm to accept. There's many other aspects to it, but they are mostly just details that fill in the picture and tie everything together. So if we can just suspend our disbelief or skepticism or indignation for a couple of minutes, just give me a couple of minutes here. To be clear, not everything is alive, only wholes that maintain themselves. So a shoe or a rock or a bicycle is not alive. If we lay them out in the wind and the rain, they do not maintain themselves. Subject to entropy, they just weather and crumble away. But if we lay an atom or a deer or a solar system out in the rain, they do maintain themselves, defying entropy. And this is one way we can recognize living things. Now, to start with, at either end of the spectrum from big to small, from atoms to galaxies, I can understand that the holistic paradigm will take some getting used to. But in the middle bit, say from the level of the cell to the level of the species, which is the traditional range of biology, you'll find this new paradigm is very easy to get on with. The reductionist paradigm, as we said before, has a very difficult time in biology. If we take a horse and look at its constituent parts and get the liver, well, we haven't really made it much easier because the liver is very complicated. But if we take the liver and look at its parts and get down to the level of the cell, well, we still haven't made it any easier. If anything, the cell is more complicated than the liver. But if we take the cell and look at its parts and get down to the level of the molecule, say DNA, well, let's just not, because it just gets even more complicated. With the holistic paradigm, it seems much easier to say that each level organises itself. The cell organises itself. It has a level of consciousness, it knows what it wants to do, and it does it. The liver organises itself. It's not organising what's happening inside the cells, it's organising how all the cells work together. And a couple of levels up, the horse is organising his level, as we do ours. Which grass does he prefer? Shall he look for some shade? Or go over and join the group? We keep coming back to consciousness, which is indeed at the heart of the holistic paradigm. So let's talk about that for a bit. We all know what consciousness is because we all have it. Consciousness is that which knows what is going on, that which has awareness, intention, and agency. And we know from ourselves how it works. Consciousness is always thinking about the future, making plans, weighing up options, and eventually it decides on one and sets in motion a train of events that coalesces in the present moment. And that's the way holistic causation works on all levels. The whole attends to the future with an element of mind or consciousness, and the parts get organised in the present and then immediately merge with the past. One question that arises is, how are we supposed to envision all these levels of consciousness? How do they manifest themselves in the real world that we all take part in? We used to think that consciousness needed a central nervous system to exist, but we've since discovered that there is also such a thing as group consciousness, as in the cases of some insects like bees, termites and ants, where the colony as a whole displays intelligent behaviour or consciousness that can't be traced back to a central nervous system or any insect in particular. And it's also emerging that trees seem to have levels of consciousness in that they communicate with other trees and make choices about the distribution of chemicals throughout their extended and interconnected root systems. Again, without a central nervous system inside. So that's obviously not the answer. Now, I'd just like to offer as a speculation that if we go back to the chain of greater wholes and look at it from this perspective, one thing stands out, namely that each whole on every level is attended by an electromagnetic field. Every atom has its own electromagnetic field. Every molecule, every cell, every organ, every animal, every plant, and every planet, every solar system, every galaxy has its own electromagnetic field. So it's a possibility that each individual consciousness might have something to do with each individual electromagnetic field. We see that the big difference between the reductionist and holistic paradigms is that in the reductionist paradigm, consciousness hardly ever gets a mention. Human beings might have consciousness, if it's not just an illusion. Perhaps some of the higher mammals, if you could even be bothered to argue about it, but that's it. Whereas in the holistic paradigm, we have to get used to a whole plethora of conscious levels, conscious entities, conscious layers, all working in, around and amongst each other, though never aware of each other. And this is something I've talked about in earlier lectures, but I'd better make sure it's clear now too. The consciousness that attends each whole only works on the level of that whole. No whole shares awareness with any other whole or with any of its parts. And no whole is aware of being a part of wholes on other levels up. Consciousness only works at the level that the whole is being organised, because that's what consciousness does, right? It organises the whole. So we are not aware of any other levels or layers of consciousness around us, although there are very many, as I'm saying, every atom, every cell, every planet, every solar system. And I'm hoping that as everyone gets used to the idea of all these levels and layers of consciousness, it won't come as too much of a surprise if I suggest that evolution is directed by a collective consciousness, applying itself to each individual case of embryonic development, organising the epigenetic processes to optimise the available DNA in accordance with its aims for the species as a whole. I implied earlier that the holistic paradigm is better able to explain quantum mechanics than the reductionist paradigm. How does that work? Well, there are several mysteries in quantum mechanics, one of which is indeterminism, another of which is entanglement. And both of these are amenable to a holistic explanation. To begin with, indeterminism is completely natural. This universe is happening for the first time. Every moment is new and full of potential. Nothing is predetermined. And that's what indeterminism means, right? Not yet determined. The best analogy for indeterminism is that it's like asking someone to think of a number. You don't know what the number is until they tell you. So can an electron think of a number? I suspect that's all they ever do. What do they think with? With their electromagnetic field. And what do they think about? Well, mostly their various possible paths or trajectories or orbits, which are their various possible futures. And we can ask an electron, as it were by measurement, what number or pathway it's thinking of. But if we ask a split second later, we'll probably get a different answer. And normally an electron is not pinned down by measurement, and instead of choosing any one pathway or orbit in particular, it maintains all of them. By thinking about them, it pushes his wave nature through all of them at once. And in general, all quantum indeterminacies are contingencies awaiting a decision. As is the case with entanglement. It's not so much that information travels from one photon to the other in Elaine Aspect's 1982 experiment. It's that the system is resolved at once, simultaneously, as a whole. We can't measure just one photon without invoking the whole system. It's the same situation as with the liver and the horse. The most interesting thing about entanglement is that the consciousness that is organising the system can span any distance instantly, which is not quite the same as saying that something is travelling faster than the speed of light. Because if consciousness is a field, then it expands as the photons separate. So it's not a question of going from one spot to another. Everything is already connected within the field. One of the strengths of the holistic paradigm, besides the fact that it can explain so many things that the reductionist paradigm cannot, is that it hangs together very consistently, very tightly, almost literally, with the chain of greater wholes working the same way on every level. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but there are many or several striking similarities between the different levels going on up. The most obvious of which is the pattern of the spiral, which repeats on all levels, from seashells to hurricanes to galaxies, in the orbits of atoms and solar systems, and even in the helix of our DNA. Another pattern that's repeated on all levels is asymmetry. Spin for electrons, polarization for molecules, and handedness for humans and galaxies. Another pattern that repeats on all levels is the tension of opposites. Positive and negative electric charge, opposing magnetic poles, and male and female sexes. And as we talked about earlier, we also find self-organization on all these levels and electromagnetic fields attending them. The fact that all these different levels have so many similarities is a strong indication that they all work the same way. And since we can see how consciousness works on our own level, the most parsimonious explanation is that it works the same way on other levels as well. See, if you reject the holistic paradigm, you end up getting stuck with a very messy set of discontinuous explanations. You have to say something like, well, living things seem to operate in some very special way that we don't quite understand, but we can see that it's different from the way that molecules and compounds operate, because those things we can understand quite easily via the reductionist paradigm, where we have a good working model involving chemical bonds and such like. Unfortunately, we will also need a third way of thinking to explain the atom, because the reductionist paradigm doesn't work at all there either. So it's a great strength of the holistic paradigm that it's so consistent. Every level works the same way. Parts, whole, consciousness, boom. From a traditional perspective, I suppose the biggest weakness of the holistic paradigm is its lack of measurability. We do like to be able to quantify things, measure things, and put the answers in an equation. That is satisfying science. But you can't measure consciousness, and you can't put it in an equation. And it is anathema to traditional science to place an ineffable, intangible awareness at the centre of everything. But that might just be how it works. In fact, it's really interesting to see how many people in the history of science have galloped up to the brink, as it were, of the holistic paradigm, but were not willing to make the intellectual leap of attributing life and consciousness to anything other than what we're already used to. Leibniz himself took the leap easily enough in 1714, but of course he had 300 years less of materialist conditioning to put aside. Jan Smuts in the 1920s, Maturana and Varela in the 1970s, and leading evolutionary biologists in 2020 all share the same reluctance or inhibition. Obviously, they say, atoms are not alive. And obviously, molecules and compounds are not alive. But the cell is alive. So there's something funny happening down around that level. But they can't quite put their finger on it, and it sort of just slips away again. At this point, there's one very obvious question. How does everything work together? How does everything hang together in nature if all wholes are oblivious of each other and only conscious at their own level? How is it that everything in nature works together so seamlessly and faultlessly? Well, that is a big question, and it has a big answer. In fact, the answer is so big that we are only just beginning to discern the shape of it, although we've been vaguely aware of it for some decades now. I'll just go ahead and tell you how I think it works, and you guys can say, huh, and decide for yourselves whether you think it hangs together or not. I said before that every whole on every level is attended by an electromagnetic field, which I'm postulating to have something to do with consciousness. All these electromagnetic fields remain separate and independent of each other, but they are all individually constantly and unceasingly interacting with the quantum zero-point field, which, on this analogy, is where the consciousness of the universe would reside, right? The electromagnetic field of the whole universe. So it's the universe itself that makes sure that everything works together by interacting with each individual whole. But each whole, on its own level, makes its own decisions about its own future with its particular measure of consciousness and free will. So nothing is predetermined. Even the universe doesn't know what's going to happen next. This all marks a very exciting time in philosophy of science. Leibniz's 300-year-old holistic paradigm, this grand intellectual construction of the chain of greater wholes, finally gets some grounding in physical reality. The implications are huge. Perhaps the first corollary is that consciousness and quantum mechanics are linked. Wherever there's consciousness, there's quantum mechanics, and wherever there's quantum mechanics, there is consciousness in the working of atomic processes, in our brains, in our DNA, and in these constant, all-pervasive interactions with the zero-point field. Well, there is your whirlwind introduction to the holistic paradigm. I hope you found it interesting. I'm not by any means saying that this is the final word on the subject. On the contrary, we're only just beginning to talk about these things and trying to figure out how it all works. But I think this is an idea worth considering. A living universe whose consciousness is mediated by the zero-point field, interacting with each individual entity in the chain of greater wholes. Thank you.